Welcome back to part two of an overview of the buy-to-let landscape presented to you by Roger Morris. So as usual, without further ado, I will hand you straight over to Roger.
I hope you found it very interesting, the timeline of how buy-to-let has developed and created the private rental sector since 1989 and how it's changed us and how yet more change will come. So why would you purchase a buy-to-let property? So I'm actually speaking as a landlord now. Why would a landlord purchase a buy-to-let? So the first one I always talk about is for your children's future. You might think, for your children's future, what does that mean? Well, as a grandparent, I'd actually think as your grandchild's future. So let's just say I've got a young granddaughter, young Natalie, and Natalie is 6 months old and she's the apple of my eye. Now I've got some money I would like to give Natalie. Could be for IHT reasons, could just because I want to give some money. I want to put it away for her future. So a lot of the times what we would have done, let's just say it was £50,000. I'm just throwing numbers out there. What you would then do is maybe take that £50,000 and put it in a building society account that Natalie could access when she's 18 or 21. And statistically, what most grandparents like I would want is to give Natalie that money for a deposit for a first house. Why not actually buy a property now? Because the reason you want to buy a house is property is overall arguably agreed is a good investment. So why don't I buy a house for my grandchild Natalie now? Well, how do you do that? So by forming a limited company, creating an SPV, having myself as the director and Natalie as a shareholder, there are lenders that are happy that if I meet the criteria and I do the personal guarantee, that the ultimate beneficiary of the property and its income would actually be my granddaughter, Natalie. So it is possible to be able to purchase a property where you, as the personal guarantor, the manager of that limited company, but the ultimate beneficiary can be your granddaughter. And therefore, when she's 18 or 21, she can either choose to come on and actually participate in the growing that portfolio. And by that time, I'd like to think in 18, 21 years, there'll be equity to extract that maybe she could then use to buy her first ever residential property. But that is just a mindset of actually looking at your children's future, or the reason that you want to incorporate. So you've got buy-to-lets with, say, husband and wife. So with me, it's me and Katie. We might make the decision to incorporate because IHT mitigation or IHT structuring between properties held in limited company and bringing children on as shareholders can work out maybe more tax effective. But again, speak to a tax advisor on this. Then there's inheritance. So speaking to wealth advisors when it comes to inheritance tax, IHT, and understanding how this can work, a lot of the older landlords will end up with portfolios with no debt, no borrowing, and they want to leave this to their children. Now, I always remember a particular gentleman who had a carpet shop in Mayfair, and he had a portfolio of £10 million, sitting having a coffee with him in a lovely part of Knightsbridge. He was really pleased that one day he would pass the portfolio on to his daughter because it had no debt. But I couldn't get my head around how could somebody have £10 million of buy-to-let property without any debt and not realising it would have an inheritance tax obligation of, at the say, 40%, £4 million. It's about making sure that you receive good and quantified tax advice to be able to understand how most effectively to leave a buy-to-let portfolio to your next of kin, again, becomes something you need to factor into that journey. Capital growth. Certainly London has benefited from capital growth over the last 30 years that I've been buying, more so than properties in Teesside. I remember when I bought my first house in 1983, I think it was. Buying a 3-bedroom semi in Stockton was roughly about buying a 3-bedroom semi in London. There wasn't that huge north-south divide, but over the 30 years of the lifetime that I've been in property, 35 years, 40 years, the time goes so quickly. I would have been far better to have purchased my buy-to-lets in London or the south than I would have been the northeast. So again, capital growth is very regional, and areas that have had good investment in infrastructure will outweigh those areas where the old heavy industry has brought down the value of particular areas. Income for somebody else is often one that comes up in my conversations. So I'd like to give you a bit of background and a bit of information when it comes to this. So let's just say, and well, the best is to give you a good example. Husband and wife. When I got married, I had buy-to-lets in my own personal name. My new wife, who currently wasn't earning any income for tax purposes, would benefit if I could give her those properties. But because of the legal process of moving properties from my name to her name would definitely involve stamp duty, would then therefore create an issue. However, after receiving tax advice, what could be arranged is a declaration of trust. So trust comes in 3 parts. First, the trust deed, which names the trustees. Then there's a beneficial interest in the property and a shared division of income. This is hidden behind the scenes and can be dissolved. You don't have to own the property to take the income from it. The trust defines this. But it's about understanding that. So what the tax advisor did for me with the deed of trust is the tax advisor may suggest that this can be done by a deed of trust where Roger agrees to hold the property in trust for my wife, Katie, and for tax purposes and certain legal purposes, Katie would have all the risks and the benefits of owning the property. It's key to transfer the obligation to pay the mortgage and debt so that Katie can deduct this against rental income received. However, a lot of lenders won't allow the transfer of the liability being moved from me, their applicant, to the wife, particularly if she doesn't work and particularly without a remortgage going through. So again, it's very easy to do transferring with a deed of trust where the property is unencumbered, but there's layers of problems when it comes to that property being mortgaged. So I would, for this example, talk about where the property has no debt and literally the transfer over of any future equity and income from the property has been given to my wife. This would have been done as a Schedule A notification and it'd be registered on land reg on an unencumbered property. For this example, makes it so much easier. If, for instance, a lender would allow the transfer of the beneficial interest being assigned to my wife, then consideration, in other words, the amount of debt being transferred over, once that debt being transferred over on an individual property exceeds 125%, 25,000, stamp duty becomes a consideration, but at the basic rate. But in simple terms, on an encumbered buy-to-let owned in my name, I can in effect give that income to my wife by simply using a trust document. And then Katie then putting that in a tax return, again, is a useful point to think of. Next is retirement income. Technically, I'm now classed at retirement age. I know, quite shocking. But I'm now taking my pension from the fire brigade because once I reach 60, pensions can become payable. However, when owning buy-to-lets in a limited company, you might want to retain the net income after corporation tax has been paid, and at the point of retirement, starting to draw that income down as your retirement income. Or you might just decide, you know what, I'm going to save the income up in the company and I will take it at its most beneficial point. Because if we look at dividend tax rate, obviously there's a lot of negativity drawn to limited companies. And even with the recent changes in the budget, which increased dividend taxation by 2%, similar to increasing taxation on income from buy-to-lets in personal names. If you remember, it moved from 20% to 22%, 40% to 42%, and 45% to 47%, but also allowing the basic rate of interest relief moving from the 20 to 22. When it comes to basic rate of dividend tax, so in other words, if I have income in a limited company, I'd rather leave the net retained profits instead of high rate dividend taxation being at 35.75% or a top rate taxpayer being 39.35%. I'm better off leaving that income in there till I retire and paying a dividend tax rate, which would be currently at 10.75%. So it does make a sizable point of retaining that property in a limited company and taking the dividends at a much better tax rate, which you can't ordinarily do if the property is held in basic names. You can't leave that for your retirement. Next is income diversification. So what that means is by having a multitude of different types of properties. So you may have properties that are standard AST or APTs, properties that are houses of multiple occupation, complex HMOs where some of the rooms or all the rooms are rented on serviced accommodation for people working away from home, or you may have holiday lets, Airbnbs, multi-unit freehold buildings, or semi-commercial. That income diversification gives your income in different components, or income today. So I can just decide to take income from my buy-to-lets now if I wish, and I do. I always have at times when I needed to supplement my income from more than one income source. COVID-19 certainly focused the self-employed's minds that they were dependent on their ability to earn, and COVID-19 took that away from a lot of people, and therefore we saw quite a significant rise in landlords owning property that was self-employed because there's more than one income. And future planning. It is about thinking that if you are self-employed and you have buy-to-lets and they're in your name, then therefore buying buy-to-lets and having them as passive income can certainly help you, certainly in times where ill health occurs or you're on holiday and you want to carry on having income coming into the family finances. Of the 4.6 million buy-to-lets today, understanding the formula for success becomes so important. Of the 4.6 million buy-to-lets, 55% have no borrowing. What a lot of us fail to remember in the world of mortgages, that more people have no borrowing than actually have borrowing. But it's about making sure that you come into contact with people who have no borrowing to say it's actually worth having debt. Because at a point, if you've got IHT considerations, debt can become your friend. Of the 4.6 million buy-to-lets, 45% have debt, and those will be held in personal ownership in the main. Limited companies have become very positive in recent years, but still the vast majority of indebted buy-to-lets are still held privately, and a lot of them are held as joint tenants, even though one applicant will be a high rate taxpayer and the other a basic rate taxpayer. Therefore, the benefit for being tenants in common on an unequal share basis in favour of the basic rate taxpayer. Yield becomes so important when we look at how to maximise the income from a buy-to-let, hence why HMOs, houses of multiple occupation, will always give a significantly higher yield than standard ASTs. And we'll cover that in the third detailed webinar that covers off houses of multiple and MUFB properties. The last deciding factor to a landlord on purchasing a property must be the interest rate. But the interest rate should never be the deciding factor of how to purchase and structure the ownership of a buy-to-let. If it is, then it'll most likely yield to a negativity when it comes to profitability of that buy-to-let. And profit is ultimately all that matters. Please remember, a buy-to-let, as much as it's housing a family, is a business, and making a profit becomes the deciding factor of being able to adequately maintain the property and being able to have a positive outlook on the properties that you manage. Making good profit by having a right equity deposit, the right ownership structure, the right yield, and obviously the right mortgage interest really does hit that formula for success. So legislative changes for landlords. What has happened and what's coming down the track? Under the Renters' Rights Bill, Section 21 will ultimately go, and this will be changed by Section 8. Having landlords' personal income insurance protection, which is normally goes hand in hand with buildings insurance offered by the bespoke buy-to-let insurance providers, is definitely worth having. If a tenant now fails to pay, eviction process can't start until they've missed 3 months, and notification of the eviction still can't happen until 4 months in arrears. With a backlog in the courts, this could take a considerable amount of time, and that's subject to all the paperwork have been correctly issued in the first place. Therefore, landlords that have payment insurance, income insurance built in with their general household buildings insurance is worthwhile. All my properties have that insurance, and I've benefited from this. It certainly works well. The Renters' Rights Bill brings in a balance between the first phase of the 1989 Housing Act, 1988 Housing Act. What this does now is it brings in rights for tenants that their families can remain in the property for a minimum period of time, which will be a 12-month period. And then there's a minimum period after that for the notice before the eviction or the rights to take the property back come into place. We will do another specific webinar on the Renters' Rights Bill, but understanding all the key components become really important. And the Renters' Rights Bill set out a decent home standards, a registration for landlords and tenants, EWAB's law to make sure the damp, mould and decent standards become a key factor, the rights to have a pet, the fact that you can no longer challenge, you can increase rents above market conditions, and also tenants can't be then starting to bid for properties. What we are seeing though, with the potential increase during this parliamentary administration of an increase of up to 5 million more people in the UK, the fact that houses are not being built at the needed required, there can be a significant amount of people wanting a property, which is therefore keeping the rights and prices of properties at an all-time high. We're going to have to wait till next year to see the conclusion of the minimum energy efficiency standard MEES and the way energy performance certificates are calculated, and whether or not we do see the increase of C. I think this would be a negative step because the vast majority, 2.4 million buy-to-let properties, are Victorian, and the estimated net cost, which is not tax deductible, is around £35,000 to improve a buy-to-let Victorian property to a C rated, but will actually, and according to the Building Back Britain report, reduce its value by about 10%. This isn't a good outcome and could see potentially mass evictions or termination of tenancies when the law becomes legislation, with landlords then looking to sell the properties. Fire safety regs for serviced accommodation will cover heavily in the 4th webinar, but ultimately a property rented out on serviced accommodation under Airbnb can no longer be rented out since April 2023 unless fire doors, smoke detectors and fixed emergency lights are put into place. Airbnb has been heavily affected by this, with the Deregulation Act 2015 coming into London and Edinburgh where it makes it illegal for a property to be rented out on serviced or short-term let accommodation for more than 90 days without having planning permission, which in most cases wouldn't be given. So if landlords are renting the properties out on Airbnb and they are making you aware, make sure that what they're doing is legal for these two particular areas. Land tax, stamp duty, surcharges becomes a really important aspect in our devolved nations, whether that be England, Northern Ireland, Wales or Scotland. Make sure that you're aware of that secondary stamp duty on second homes becomes apparent. And landlord licensing really started in London, which was another act of which we'll cover under the 2004 Housing Act. The 2004 Housing Act gave the right to create selective and additional licensing, but this now will come right the way through England, I think by the end of this year. And the 2004 Housing Act HMO definition of where three people comprising of more than one family unit sharing one or more facility, toilet, kitchen or bathroom is defined as a HMO. Do not make the mistake of going off a lender is happy for three non-related people to go on one AST and wouldn't class as a HMO. It is a HMO. What a lender defines within its criterion products is nothing to do with what the law defines. Article 4 directive becomes very important. So for instance, if I was to ring you up as a landlord saying, could you arrange a purchase of a 2-bed new build flat in Birmingham and I'm going to rent it to 3 students, you would need to know before you answer the question whether or not that 2-bed new build flat is in an Article 4 area, which it is, and whether or not the local authority has now achieved its maximum capacity for HMOs, which it has, which means you would not be able to arrange a HMO mortgage or any mortgage, and that property would not legally be let to 3 students in Birmingham because it wouldn't get planning permission as it stands at the moment, and you could be liable for the cost to compensate the tenants at the point they would need to be legally evicted because you gave planning advice. So be very careful when asked, is it okay to arrange and can you arrange a buy-to-let for students if you don't know there's an Article 4 or a selective or additional license in place and what the local authorities' rules are. So how can landlords deal with these challenges? By working with you, the specialist mortgage advisor. Speaking to your mortgage advisor now becomes apparent key. But if I was to go onto your website today, this afternoon, me and Natalie, we're going to look at your website and see whether or not it actually has designated pages to explain what a HMO is, what a multi-unit freehold building is, what a short-term let and serviced accommodation is, what's a holiday let, and what are your skills, testimony and feedback from other landlords that you've helped. Be the go-to specialist mortgage advisor in your area. Be the one that is going to focus their attention. If you can do that, then your website will become your best marketing tool. Remember, for younger landlords, they will not deal with an advisor until they've actually gone on the website. So make sure it's up to date. Make sure when you're doing a remortgage, you ask, is the property held in joint tenants or tenants in common? Specifically ask this question. If a married couple, one is a high rate taxpayer and one is a basic rate taxpayer, because you knowingly understand there could be a financial benefit for receiving tax advice. You cannot give tax advice, but if you're doing a fact find and you find out one's high rate and one's basic, and you know that they are submitting a tax return as joint tenants, then just common sense, experience and passing CMAP will know that if they receive tax advice, they'd most likely end up paying less tax. Unencumbered properties are now in the main, always have been. There's more unencumbered properties than encumbered. And therefore, there's an opportunity to be able to refinance them, part of a structured IHT plan. Always get expert tax advice, accountancy advice, lettings advice, legal advice, and mortgage advice. But each individual should stick in their own areas of expertise. Declarations of trusts can be used for tenants in common, where a property is going to be taken on an equal share basis, or where property is going to be passed over to in trust to a wife or a husband, for example. Structures of ownership can change dramatically the net income position after tax, from making losses to making profits. As a buy-to-let, lenders will want to see the buy-to-let property always making a profit. It is a business after all. In 2007, a number of lenders unfortunately went into administration and went bust because of the mass fraudulence created through property clubs at the time operating in the United Kingdom. A lot of lenders today are still very negative about property clubs because landlords can access properties to purchase on the open market through estate agents, publicly marketed and auction sites. So again, if a client is buying through a property club, again, a lot of lenders will be against this, particularly with the 6-month rule of ownership of funding of financing was brought in to protect lenders from further misuse and fraudulence. Limited companies are now virtually the way every landlord will purchase a property. Why? They can offset 100% of finance cost, including lender fees, and the transfer of property ownership as part of IHT planning to the children can become and seen as the most tax efficient way. Understanding this becomes a key part of why limited companies are so popular. Protecting your client's asset is a life policy. Since the Renters' Rights Bill came in and the time frame taken to evict a family can be a matter of months, and a lot of months, over a year, having a life policy held in trust to pay off the lenders in the event of primarily the active manager between husband and wife of a property portfolio makes real sense. A lot of the times, if let's say applicant one was a person who managed the portfolio and a life policy is offered, they'll often say, well, if I die, we'll just sell the properties. Well, if they die, they're dead and can't do that. However, the surviving partner might not be competent in managing the portfolio or want to deal with the huge legal burden of eviction, where a simple large life policy, which in a limited company is classed as a business expense, and even if not, is definitely worth doing, is something you should speak to your landlords on. Top slicing is very important. I would always explain top slicing is really for where a landlord has up to 3 financed buy-to-let properties, is not a portfolio landlord. Normally would need to earn a minimum of £100,000 a year because the ONS data feed would take away anybody's income less than 100 grand generally. Above that, where they've got provable surplus income, top slicing is a very viable product. And our sister company, Moda Mortgages, does this in a great way. Lenders' affordability calculations are on each lender's website and will help you understand both stress testing, the background portfolio, and the new properties to buy and the options of top slicing. 5-year fixes means you have to reduce the liability or the ability to increase stress testing for 2-year products. However, Moda Mortgages on a pound for pound remortgage will happily do it on pay rate. And particularly if in a limited company and you've got a 5% fee, which is tax deductible, as the accountancy does the tax return, can be also appealing. Now, whether or not you go for a larger lender fee versus a lower fixed rate, in simple terms, in a limited company, if you go for a 5% lender fee, you will get a lower fixed rate. Over a 5-year period, if you had, let's say, 2 bank accounts, 2 limited companies, one with a 5% fee and one with a 0% fee, the net income or the amount of cash left in the bank account at the end of the 5 year, the one that had the 0% fee will have roughly the difference less than the one that had the 5% fee. Let's say that was £10,000. There'd be £10,000 more income in that bank account than there would be with the 0% fee. The way lenders work out product fees, it's all in the mix. It's either do you want a lower rate to fit ICR, but the actual benefit to the customer is equal, but it's just the mindset of that large lender fee. At the end of the 5 years, by putting in simple terms to try and explain, sending the original offer letter to the accountant to put that fee in the allowable deductions of costs before corporation tax is generated, means that ultimately the landlord would save 19% of that fee in their actual tax liability. Is a simple overview. If you understand the math, you speak to your accountant, a tax advisor, they might be able to help you understand how at the end of that 5 year fixed, the cash will be there to repay that lender fee, which means it's just part of the overall cost of finance, but they will, in theory, work out the same or maybe slightly better if you follow the accountancy procedure on this. Deposits can come from refinances, from remortgages or residential, inheritances, taking money out of pension pots, which is very common, or savings. And the difference in type of tenancy can be quite dramatic, whether or not it's an AST, short-term, serviced accommodation, HMO properties, can all make real big differences. Background and affordability stress testing of making the existing portfolio stand up on its own 2 feet, being able to cover off that 5.5% ICR stress test rate, and whether it's been stressed at 125% for limited company portfolio backgrounds or a 140 if it's held in personal names, becomes so important to ensure the portfolio can maintain itself for those volatility in bank-based rates and lender fixed rates. Portfolio diversification is definitely the norm, not just having standard 3-bedroom semi, considering of HMOs, student accommodation, serviced accommodation, and all this we'll go into over the next few webinars. And who'll manage the portfolio? I advocate a letting agent. One, their fees are tax deductible, so therefore it's an allowable expense which can keep me in that basic rate tax bracket or being able to keep corporation tax down. But also with the advent of Renters' Rights Bill, I really value a letting agent. So we now come to the end of the second part of this webinar. I want to thank you for your time. Unfortunately, because this is recorded, we can't answer any questions, but Natalie and I will often run online webinars where you've got your chance to come on and answer any questions. Natalie, back to you.
Thank you again, Roger, for all of that wonderful information. I'm sure everybody found it really helpful. So, yeah, thanks for joining us, and join us for the next webinar that you'll hopefully see soon. Take care.
Bye.